Good afternoon. How is everybody today? You had your lunch, you're not even a little bit sleepy. And you're here for R2T4, so welcome. So my name is David Musser. I'm with Policy Liaison and Implementation Office with Federal Student Aid. I'm here with Rick Renshaw, one of our esteemed training officers, who, with his colleagues, as Wayne said the other day, could tell you a whole lot more than I could or probably anyone else could in the world about the full life cycle of the federal student aid process. So I'm glad to have him here. So this the presentation is R2T4 Basic Principles, and it is a presentation that's intended to give you a fairly high-level overview of the Return of Title IV process. R2T4 is the acronym that we use for those who are new. And it's really intended for those who are new to the R2T4 process or veterans who are seeking a refresher, kind of coming back to this after some time or just to check up on some of the details that you may have forgotten after doing this for so many years. There is another session immediately following this called R2T4 Advanced Concepts, and that will have some information about some of the more advanced things that relate to R2T4, and one of the things in that session that we're going to cover is modules. So if you guys have questions about modules, and that's the only reason that you're here, we're not going to talk about that today. We're only going to cover the basics, and we're going to cover in great detail a lot more about modules in the next session, which I'm having with Greg Martin from the Office of Post-Secondary Education. Here in this session, we'll be discussing requirements for both credit hour and clock hour programs, and we will, if there are differences, we will express that as we get to that part of the presentation. Sometimes those things are a bit different, but we'll clearly note when that's the case. Before I get started, just a few housekeeping items. We will have questions at the end of the session, so please hold those until that point. We also will email you an evaluation after the end of the conference, so let us know how you like this presentation, and if you have feedback, we're always interested in your feedback. We just want you to know that we appreciate that you guys are interested in this topic, and we are excited to present on this. So before we get started, here's a quick look at our agenda for today. These are all the things we're going to talk about, at least briefly. And I wanted to note that at the very last bullet here, case studies, we aren't going to actually go through the two case studies that we have traditionally talked about at this presentation. They're a little long, and we are running a little short on time given all what we want to present today. But they're there for your reference if you want to walk through the whole process of an R2T4 calculation from the very beginning. You can do that, and it's probably a worthy exercise if you've never done this before. So let's start out with some basic principles about the Return of Title IV process. First, Title IV funds are awarded to a student with the assumption that they'll attend for the entire period for which they were awarded. And when a student ceases attendance prior to that ending date, the student may not be eligible for the full amount of Title IV funds that they were originally scheduled to receive. The calculation that we're going to go through is designed to determine how much aid the student earned and then assign responsibility for who has to return any aid that was unearned. And so here are some basic principles that kind of flow from the very fundamental principles I just mentioned. Student earns Title IV aid equal to the amount of attendance that he or she completes in a payment period or period of enrollment. And you'll see these acronyms, payment period, PP, and period of enrollment, POE, throughout the presentation. The percentage of aid earned is equal to the percentage completed. Percentage of aid earned is equal to the percentage of the period the student was scheduled to complete as of the withdrawal date for clock hour programs. If a school has dispersed more aid than the student earned, Title IV aid must be returned. And if a school has dispersed less Title IV aid than a student has earned once you've done the calculation, then a post-withdrawal disbursement is calculated. And you have to offer that, either disperse the aid to the student if it's a grant, or offer the aid to the student if it's a loan. Some other really important, I would say vital principles to the R2T4 process. If a student completes or is scheduled to complete more than 60% of the payment period or period of enrollment, based on your calculation, that student has earned 100% of their aid for that payment period or period of enrollment. Note that when we say more than 60%, what we mean is 60.01%. And that's the amount that they need in order to have earned 100%. If they've earned exactly 60%, according to your calculation, they're still going to have an amount unearned, 40%. The second point here is that institutional or other refund policies do not impact the amount of Title IV aid that a student earns under the RTT4 calculation. And this is a really important thing to note. We'll talk a little bit more about it when we mention institutional charges. But the RTT4 process is completely independent from your institutional refund process. The tuition refunds that you may make as a result of a withdrawal do have no impact on a student's RTT4 calculation, except insofar, and we'll talk about this at the end, as they may affect the remaining credit balance after the whole process is completed. And Rick will talk a little bit about that later on. And schools should use the best information available to determine a student's withdrawal date, and that's just something that the department expects in all cases for these calculations. There is some general information here about the consumer information that every school is required to provide regarding the RTT4 process. You have to provide any refund policy that the school has to comply with, specified by your accreditor, your state, any other governing body. You have to express your school's refund policy, that's your tuition refund policy, and the requirements for the treatment of Title IV funds after withdrawal. Every school has to have a return of Title IV process, and you have to explain what the student needs to know about that process. And as part of that, you have to explain your institutional policy on official withdrawals, including you have to name the administrative offices that handle that process so that students can complete it in a timely way. All of these things are things that you have to make available to students through appropriate methods. Could be, appropriate publications, mailings, online, or emails to students, but it has to be available to prospective and current students. So we actually only have one slide on this topic, but it's a really, really important one that I want to emphasize. So this is when a student fails to begin attendance in a payment period or period of enrollment. In these cases, you can't document that a student attended even one day of any class during a payment period, then that student was not eligible for Title IV aid for that payment period in any way. In that case, if Title IV aid was dispersed, and many institutions do disperse Title IV aid early or before, 10 days before the beginning of the period, then instead of RTT4 does not apply. The provisions under 668.21 apply, and that's a separate part of the regulations from the return of Title IV requirements. In that case, all Pell Grant, FSA, Federal Perkins Loan, Iraq Afghanistan Service Grant, and Teach Grant funds must be returned, every dollar. Direct loan funds credited to the student's account must be returned, and then the direct loan servicer must be notified when funds were dispersed directly to the student. So all of this is to say that you have to have a way for identifying at least one day of attendance for students, and schools have a lot of different ways of doing that. I've heard from some schools that have a add drop period during which they require a brief period of attendance taking. Their instructors will take attendance just to see that students were there for one day during that period. And some schools don't do that, but they wait until the end of the period, and any student who doesn't have any earned grades, even earned Fs, if you do that at the end of the period, they'll go back and ask their faculty to identify any attendance whatsoever for students, and if they can't find it, then that student is going to be subject to 668.21, and you'll have to return everything for them. So it's just something to keep in mind and to make sure that your institution has a policy to deal with this situation. All right, now we want to talk a little bit about how the calculation works. We're going to go through kind of the nuts and bolts of how the RTT4 calculation works so that you can see the whole flow of the process. The first step is to determine the exact amounts of Title IV aid that the student was eligible for at the time of the withdrawal. And that includes both amounts that were actually dispersed to the student and amounts that could have been dispersed to the student, but for whatever reason, just weren't dispersed at the time of the withdrawal. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that a little bit later in the presentation. Rick will give you some information about how that part works. So in this step, you're going to find all of the types of aid that were on the account or could have been dispersed at that time. You're going to enter them. You can see here we have a screenshot of the actual RTT4 worksheet. You can see Pell Grant, FSA, Teach Grant, Unsub, Sub, all of those things. And there's two columns, amount dispersed there on the left and amount that could have been dispersed on the right. And you'll enter all the information in there. Of course, your system may also have a system for doing these calculations that mimics this worksheet. I would note that this particular screenshot is taken from the old version of the RTT4 worksheet. Some of you have probably already seen that we have a new version that excludes the Academic Competitiveness Grant and the SMART Grant. Those haven't been around for years, and if you gave a disbursement of ACG or SMART, there's a bigger problem here probably. So once you've identified the amounts that students are eligible for, now the next step in step 2 is to determine the amount the student earned for the period. So at this point, we're really doing a simple calculation. We're calculating in the numerator the number of days the student completed, and we're calculating the denominator the total days in the period. So that sounds really simple, but how to get to those two numbers becomes obviously much more complicated, as you guys probably are aware. This is the first time where there's a difference between the credit hour and clock hour calculations, and we're going to talk about the credit hour calculation first. In this case, the numerator, as I mentioned, is completed days in the payment period or period of enrollment, and the denominator is the total days. When you divide those two, you end up with a percentage, and that percentage is the percentage earned for the period, whichever one you're using. On the clock hour side, it's very similar, except when you're determining the amount a student earned, you're looking at hours scheduled to complete over the total hours in the period. And the same thing applies if it's greater than 60%, the student earns 100% for the period. The numerator is the scheduled hours as of the withdrawal date. The denominator is the total hours of the period. All right, so then on steps 3 and 4, we're going to multiply the amount that students were eligible for. So that we're going to multiply the amount the student earned, the percentage, by the total amount of aid that the student either was dispersed or that the student could have been dispersed. If the amount is less than the amount dispersed, then a return is required, and we're going to go on to determine who's responsible for making the return. If the amount that the student earned is greater than the amount that you dispersed, then a post-withdrawal disbursement is required. And Rick's going to talk a little bit more about post-withdrawal disbursements in just a little bit. So if a return is required, then the institution needs to determine the amount of unearned Title IV funds that it's required to return. And step 5 is the part of the calculation where we figure that part out. The idea behind dividing the responsibility for returning funds is that we are looking at how much the institution charged the student, and we're hoping to find out how much of the Title IV aid went toward those charges, so that the school received, in order for the school to then be required to return those funds back to the department, as opposed to the student who didn't really see those funds. So in order to do that, the amount of funds due from the institution is calculated by adding all of the institutional charges incurred by the withdrawal date, and then multiplying that total by the percentage of the period that the student did not complete. And you can see that here on the slide. There are some important things to remember about institutional charges. They are what the school initially charges the student, plus any changes that are unrelated to the withdrawal and occur before the withdrawal. So for example, a lot of schools may have an add-drop period during which a student can drop out of a class and get a full refund for it. In that case, you would incorporate the change in the charges that results from dropping that class, or potentially adding that class if there's an increase in tuition. So you will incorporate all of those changes to tuition and fees to your institutional charges up to the time that the student withdraws. If a change is made on the same day as a withdrawal related to the withdrawal, and again, this is going back to your institutional refund policies, that change would not be incorporated into what you put into the calculation. So if your institutional refund policy is to return, half of the tuition if the student is completed half of the period, then that part is ignored, and you'll give the initial the tuition charges or the tuition charges before that change was applied. Now, once the institution determines the total amount of unearned aid that it's responsible for returning to ed, the institution must return funds in a very specific order, what we call the statutory order, because it's outlined in the RTT4 statute. So you can see here on the slide, it goes from generally loans to grants, unsubsidized loans, then subsidized loans, then plus loans, and all the way down to Pell Grants and down the list. And again, this is from the old worksheet. There's no academic competitiveness grants or SMART grants in the current worksheet. So finally, once the institution has determined the amounts of each type of unearned Title IV aid that it must return, any unearned amounts that were dispersed are the responsibility of the student, with, again, the presumption being that those funds went to the student. Generally, maybe they were a credit balance, direct disbursement, whatever, and the student now has those funds in his or her possession, and he or she is responsible for returning it. And when that happens, remaining unearned Title IV loan funds are just repaid through the normal provisions of the loan, so no further action by the institution is required for those. However, for grant funds, if greater than 50% of the total grant assistance dispersed for the period, if that student has unearned funds that exceed that amount, then the amount that exceeds 50% is considered a grant overpayment. The institution must notify the student within 45 days of his or her obligation to repay those funds. And then in order to do that, you have a number of different options that you can pursue. The student can give you a full immediate payment. You can make repayment arrangements that are satisfactory to you, the school, with the student, or you can assign the amount as an overpayment to the department's default resolution group. I do want to give a shout out to some very, very helpful guidance that our operational folks posted about overpayments back in September of 2016, so an electronic announcement on September 16th, 2016. If you are interested, take a look at that, a very careful look. They have a great chart that explains the various times that you need to return funds in COD versus reporting things to the debt collections office. And the idea is we don't want you to double report. If you return funds on behalf of a student, which you're allowed to do, and you make the returns in COD and G5, you don't also want to send that over to debt collections, because that's essentially double reporting. The government's going to get twice the money back that it should have gotten, and we don't want it. We really actually don't want that. We want the student and you guys to give back only what should be given back. All right, so now that's a lot about the calculation itself, and now we're going to start digging down into the details of how the calculation works. So we're going to start out with probably one of the most important things that you have to deal with in this calculation, and that's the actual requirements for rounding in the calculation. And our training officers have done a great job communicating this in all of our training presentations, but we're going to talk about it one more time here. So in the calculation, you round to the nearest penny when you're calculating dollar amounts, and you can see the example of that here. When you're actually making the disbursement or refund, you can round to the nearest dollar. So if you're actually doing a post-withdrawal disbursement or actually returning funds to the department, then you can take the amount that you have in cents that you did when you calculated it, and you can round that to the nearest dollar. When you're doing the calculation itself, you calculate out to 4 decimal places. So you can see here in the example, 45 days over 101 days equals 0.4455. But then you round from that to the 3rd decimal place. So in the same example, 0.4455 equals 0.446 equals 44.6%. So those are the basic rounding rules, and you can always return to these if you're wondering, and you should definitely make sure that your system is equipped to use these rounding rules. If you get it even a little bit wrong, and sometimes if you calculate it too accurately, you calculate out to more than 4 decimal places, you can end up with situations where you're getting a few dollars off on a lot of your calculations, and you don't want to do that because even those would be considered errors. All right, so now we want to talk a little bit about payment periods or periods of enrollment. And so remember back in step 2, we discussed how to determine the amount the student earned. Well, now we're going to talk a little bit more about how that actually plays out and some of the details about how you're going to get to those numbers. The first thing we're going to talk about here is the denominator. So the total number of days in an institution's payment period or period of enrollment constitutes the denominator of the RTT4 calculation. And we sometimes refer to this as the quote-unquote the basis for your RTT4 calculation, because this is really going to determine both the amounts of aid that you include in the calculation, and it's going to determine how many days the student completed of the total. So when you're looking at how many days you include in this denominator, the total days excludes scheduled breaks of 5 days or more. Total days also excludes leaves of absence in periods in which the student was not enrolled in any modules. Now, some schools have a choice as to which they want to use. If you have a standard term program, you must use the payment period. You don't have a choice. If you have a non-term or a non-standard term program, you can use either the payment period or the period of enrollment, but you must use consistently for all students in the same program. It can be different from program to program. So here's some visual examples of how this works in practice. To illustrate, this is a credit hour example, and assume that these are non-standard terms. You can see the payment period is August 19th to December 6th. That's one payment period. The period of enrollment is August 19th to May 7th, which includes 2 payment periods. So let's just assume that this school's academic year is comprised of 2 non-standard terms. The period of enrollment is essentially the whole academic year. So which do you use? Why would an institution choose to use one or the other? So here's an example that may illustrate why a school might choose to use one or the other, depending on how their program is designed. So in this example, a student leaves 21 days in the second term of a 2-term academic year. And again, let's assume these are non-standard terms because there wouldn't be a choice if this was a standard term program. So look, if you look on the payment period side, the student completed 21 of 100 days, and the total Title IV-A dispersed was $2,000. So the amount that the student earned was $420 in that payment period, and they earned $2,000 in the previous payment period. So for the whole academic year, they earned $2420. If the school was using the period of enrollment, then the total number of days is 200, so that's the entire academic year, and the number of days completed is 121. In that case, the student has earned 60.5%, and that means the student earned 100%, and that means the student earned $4,000 in Title IV-A rather than $2,420. So in these cases where you have a program where students tend to drop out at the end of the academic year, and I've heard of some of these programs, especially technical programs or programs where the difficulty quickly increases throughout the program, this may be something that you want to use. But payment period does tend to be the most commonly used form for RT4 calculations. And just a note, this is a credit hour calculation. We'll get to the clock hour version of this in just a second. I mentioned before that institutionally scheduled breaks of 5 or more consecutive days are excluded from both the numerator and the denominator of an RT4 calculation. Breaks of less than 5 consecutive days are not excluded. Those are included in the RT4 calculation. So as an example, a school has a break from Wednesday, November 26th that ends on Friday, November 28th. They don't offer classes on the weekend. So then the 5 days that extend from November 26th through the end of the weekend, Sunday, November 30th, would be excluded because the weekend days where there's no classes get included in what we call a break. Technically, really, every weekend that you don't have classes is a 2-day break, but because it's less than 5 days, those days get included in the calculation normally. So this is a clock hour version of the same kind of thing that we were discussing before, and all the things are the same except in a clock hour program, the definition of your payment period or period of enrollment is in hours, not in days. So you can see here the payment period is 450 hours, the period of enrollment is about 900 hours. And the same thing is true. You have to apply whichever one you choose consistently with all students in the same program. And this example is also similar to the last one. You can see here if the student left when he or she was scheduled to complete 550 hours in a 900-hour program, the student would have earned $444 in the payment period added to the $2,000 in the prior period. In the period of enrollment, he's more than 60%, so the student has earned the full $4,000. So the same concept applies in a clock hour program. So now I want to talk a little bit about what leaves of absences are, because this is also important when you're looking at your denominator and also the numerator of your calculation. So a leave of absence, and the acronym that we tend to use is LOA, is a temporary interruption in a student's program of study that is not a withdrawal. We don't consider these students to have withdrawn. And we have a lot of conditions for an approved LOA because we want to ensure that there's only very specific circumstances where you can let a student leave without having withdrawn. You have to have a formal written policy. The student has to follow the formal policy when he requests the leave of absence. There must be a reasonable expectation that the student will return from the leave of absence. The school must approve the leave of absence in accordance with its policy. The student may not be charged anything additional in institutional charges. The number of days that a student can spend on an LOA in a 12-month period, it cannot exceed 180 days. And you have to inform loan recipients about the effects on their grace period if they don't return, because as we'll discuss in a little bit, if they don't return from a leave of absence, then their withdrawal date is going to go back to the last day of attendance or the withdrawal date prior to that leave of absence. So that's when their grace period will start counting, and they may have to start repaying their loans quite soon after they tell you that they're not coming back. A few details about leaves of absences. Formal written policy must require requests for to be submitted in writing and must include the reason for the request. Must require all the requests be signed and dated, and you must request the requests must be submitted in advance unless unforeseen circumstances prevent the student from doing so. So there certainly could be cases where the student has an accident, some other reason that they need to request a leave of absence and it's already occurred. You can allow for that, and you can have some exceptions for those cases. As I mentioned, you can't have any additional charges. You can't even have any reentry charges if you are considering them to be on a leave of absence. Obviously, that doesn't apply if they withdraw and they come back. You can't have any additional Title IV aid while a student is on an LOA, so you can't award any additional Title IV aid while the student's on an LOA. You can disperse grant funds if you've already awarded them by the time the student goes on the leave of absence, but you may not disperse loan funds in these cases, so that's another important thing to consider. You can grant multiple leaves of absence, but remember, the same thing I mentioned just before applies. The student can't spend more than 180 days in all the leaves of absence in a calendar year, and the calendar year starts on the very first day of the very first leave of absence the student takes. If the leave of absence does not meet regulatory requirements, the student must be considered the withdrawal as of the last date of attendance. If the student fails to return from a leave of absence, they are considered a withdrawal as of the last date of attendance. The date of determination in this case is the date that the institution discovers that the student won't return, but it can't be more than 14 days following the end of the leave of absence. So you can't just sit around and wait for a long time before making the decision that they're not coming back. And also, as always, remember that NSLDS enrollment reporting should be adjusted to report the student was of withdrawal back to the last day of attendance, not the end of the leave of absence. So this is another important point. For standard term or non-standard term programs, the student must resume training at exactly the same point that the student began the leave of absence. And this is actually a reason that we don't see leaves of absence in standard term or non-standard term programs very often, because effectively what we're saying is, let's assume that the student was taking English 101 and the student got to the 5th week, was studying Chaucer, and then had to drop out. The only way that the student could take a leave of absence and come back in the spring term, let's say he dropped out in the fall, would be for the student to have exactly the same class and to resume that class talking about Chaucer again. So it's not an easy thing for schools to do, and we don't see it very often. But we have actually heard of some schools have maybe modules within a term or payment period where the student gets to the end of the module and wants to come back. There are a very, very limited number of cases where you might put someone on a student leave of absence between periods, but it is rare. For non-term credit hour programs, the student does not have to resume training at the same point the student began the leave of absence, and that's where you usually see leaves of absence are in clock hour programs or non-term credit hour programs. All right, so now I'm going to move on to withdrawal date. So we talked about the denominator of the calculation, the total days or hours in the period, depending on what kind of program you have. Now we're going to talk about the numerator, how to determine the hours, the amount that in the case of a clock hour program that the student was scheduled to complete as of the withdrawal date. So as I said, the institution uses the number of hours the student was scheduled to complete in order to get to that denominator, or get to that numerator. And in a clock hour program, a student is considered to have withdrawn if he or she does not complete all the clock hours and weeks scheduled in the payment period or period of enrollment. The scheduled clock hours used in an RT4 calculation are those established by the school prior to the student's beginning class date for the payment period or period of enrollment. And a couple of things about scheduled hours, because this is obviously a very important part of any clock hour calculation. Those scheduled hours have to be established in accordance with your accrediting agency or state requirements, and they have to be consistent with what you've published to students. So you can't just make a change and not tell anyone about it. Now, importantly, you can make a change to your schedule in the middle of a payment period. You just need to be sure that you clearly document it and that you explain it to students in written form so that you have that documentation ready and you can show your auditor or program reviewer later on that the schedule was changed and you used the new schedule following that date. The scheduled hours in the numerator of an RT4 calculation don't include hours scheduled on days when the student was on a leave of absence, or extra or makeup hours that were not part of the student's normal schedule, as published in your policies or as established in writing elsewhere. All right, the last thing that I'm going to talk about is our withdrawal dates for credit hour programs. I'm just going to touch on this and let Rick finish up this discussion. But a student's withdrawal date determines the number of days that the student is considered to have completed, and it helps determine the numerator of the RT4 calculation in a credit hour program. And similarly to what we've just discussed, completed days excludes scheduled breaks of 5 days or more. Completed days also excludes leaves of absence and periods in which the student was not enrolled in any modules. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Rick to lead you through the withdrawal date discussion and finish up the presentation.
Good afternoon. I always hated the session right after lunch because I always wanted to go to sleep. So I usually picked a place over on the side where I could kind of turn sideways and nobody would see me sleeping. We've got these bright lights up here, so I can't see you anyway. So if you want to go ahead and nod off for the rest of the session, that'll be okay. Then you'll be fresh for the next session. There. Dave just talked about the withdrawal date and what it was used for in the RTT4 calculation. And so what we want to talk about now is called the required to take attendance. Now, clock hour schools are required to keep attendance records, very meticulous attendance records. So when we talk about determining the withdrawal date and knowing when the withdrawal date occurs, clock hour schools have it pretty easy because you can always just look at the record and then that you know when the last day the student attended. If you're in a standard term-based program, you have some options. There's two types of institutions when we talk about required to take attendance, those that are required to take and those that are not required to take attendance. And so if you're not required to take attendance, there's going to be some options for you. So let's talk about required to take attendance for just a minute. And as I mentioned, clock hour is always required, so that doesn't give you a lot of options, those of you that are in clock hour programs. An institution that is required to take attendance is defined as one of these type of schools. It could be where you have an outside entity that requires you to take attendance. It could be an accrediting agency, it could be a state agency, some governing body that says your programs, you have to keep attendance so we know that the students actually sat in the class or participated through the payment period. So if an outside entity requires attendance to be taken, you are an institution that's required to take attendance. It may be that your school has its own requirement. It could be at the institutional level. Your school may just have decided we want to take attendance and all of our instructors are going to take attendance. If that's the case, then you as an institution are required to take attendance. Sometimes it might be a department or it could be even a program that requires that its instructors take attendance. If that's the case, then those programs that are in that department or that program that requires attendance, when students withdraw from those programs, you have to treat your school as one as required to take attendance for those students who withdraw from those particular programs. Now, a lot of times a faculty member just wants to keep up with his or her class. And if a faculty member chooses to take attendance for his or her class, that's okay. They can do that. It doesn't change the definition of what your school is. So if the school doesn't require it, nobody requires to take attendance, the faculty member just decides to do it on their own, you are not defined as an institution that required to take attendance. There's a few cases where it might be that some entity that the school is getting money from or the student is getting money from has some requirement that the only way that requirement can be met is by taking attendance. And in those particular cases, then that program or that institution would be considered one that is required to take attendance. Here's a couple of examples of what we mean when we say required to take attendance. Here's an example here where an outside agency provides a scholarship for 10 students, and in order for those students to maintain that scholarship, they have to attend. And so attendance is required to be kept for those students. If one of those students were to withdraw, there would have to be an attendance record that would have to be used to determine that student's withdrawal date, because those 10 students are considered in a situation where the institution is required to take attendance. Here's another example here where the state may require the school to keep attendance records for the first 10 days of class up to the census date, let's say. And so if the state requires that your school take attendance for those first 10 days, anyone that withdraws during that period of time, you're going to have an attendance record on them, and therefore you would use the rules for the school that is required to take attendance in determining the withdrawal date for that student. The term census date is probably familiar with most of you that are in standard term-based programs. Generally, an institution will have a particular date into the semester where they set their official enrollment for the payment period. That's generally called a census date. Sometimes it's called the last date to add drop or the add drop date. There's different terms for it. But whatever it is, it's that single date during the near the beginning of the payment period where the enrollment is set for the semester, and that's the numbers they use for their advertising and for their reporting and those different things. If you have a census date, that census date in and of itself does not make you an institution that's required to take attendance. You're simply taking account on a specific date, and that doesn't change your designation. Sometimes you might have embedded modules within your program. If you have embedded modules, you can have a census date for each one of those modules so that you're checking each module to get the official count for that module during the payment period, and that also does not change your designation of what kind of institution you are, so you don't have to lose any sleep over that. Now, if you are required to take attendance, you have to use the official attendance records to determine the student's withdrawal date, and you're going to have the record there simply looking it up. And this also includes those situations that I mentioned a while ago where you have a limited period of time when you're taking attendance. If a student withdraws during that limited period of time, you're at that point in time considered an institution that is required to take attendance. You would have the attendance records, and you would use those records to determine the student's withdrawal date or last date of attendance. Now, institutions that are not required to take attendance are basically any situation that we haven't already discussed that would make you an institution that's required to take attendance. And generally, most of your standard term-based institutions, you have a fall and spring semester, most institutions are not required to take attendance. You will know whether you are or not by the definitions we just discussed for you. If you're not required to take attendance, then you have some options on how to determine that withdrawal date for your students, because you won't have those attendance records to look up the student's last activity. Because there are some options there, we need to determine, well, what do we mean when we say last date of attendance or withdrawal date? So we look at academic attendance. In the regulatory language, we say attendance at an academically related activity, and you can go to the handbook and look, and we have some sections in the handbook that talk about what we mean when we say attendance at an academically related activity. Here on this slide, you've got some examples of what we mean when we say academic attendance. The student actually sits in the classroom, puts his rear end into the seat, and he's there. And that's attendance, obviously. It could be that the student turns in an assignment on a particular day, and the instructor has recorded that he or she received that assignment, and so that was an academic activity. It could be taking an exam, could be an interactive tutorial in distance learning or computer-based instruction. It could be that the group meets together, a group from the class met together at the library last night, and they worked on a project, and somebody could verify that that student was at that study group. That could be an activity. Participated in an online discussion that is academically related, or interacting online with a faculty member about a subject matter or to ask course-related questions. Now, these last two are pretty important when you're dealing with distance learning and you're trying to figure out the withdrawal date for a student that was in an online course. When R2T4 first came out back in 2000, 1999 and 2000, and we were in the early stages of distance learning really becoming popular, that was a big question we always asked. You know, how do you know that a student is attending? And a lot of people thought, well, if we we have a log, and we know when the student logged in on and to the class, and we can just take those logs, and that would be our documentation that the student had attended the class, and everybody thought that was cool. But that needed to be clarified because we found out that some students could log in and they could immediately log back out and never participate in the class. So when you're looking at academic attendance, this slide here tells you some things that are not academic attendance. One is living in the housing and eating in the meals in the cafeteria. Just because they're on campus doesn't mean they're attending academically. Just because they logged into a course doesn't mean that they're participating academically in that course. So you cannot just use the logs from your IT department. It has to be active participation. It has to be participating in that. Student goes by and talks to the academic counselor and says, I'm having problems and I'm not sure what I'm going to do with the rest of the semester. Just going by and visiting the academic counselor, maybe making plans for next semester's enrollment, those are not academic activities in our definition of attendance. So make sure that when you're documenting the academic activity that it truly is something that the student is participating in for their education. As you're looking at academic attendance and you're not required to take attendance, it's sometimes a little bit difficult to know exactly what date was the student's last date of attendance. If you're not required to take attendance, you can always use the last date of academic-related activity as the withdrawal date. It would have to be documented, obviously. You'd know that the student was there. You can always use that last date that the student attended. It doesn't have to be, if they are unofficially withdrawn, it does not have to be the midpoint if you've got a later date. But here's the thing. If the student comes in and said, I didn't finish the semester, but this is the date that I quit going to school, it's not a self-certification thing. It's got to be the school documenting the last date of activity, not the student. You can't take the student's word for it. We allow a lot of student self-certifications, but this is one instance here where the student cannot self-certify. There has to be something. You need to go back. He needs to bring something from the instructor, something that can document that the last date of attendance, what it was. Cannot be self-certified. Now, we know the clock hour schools have attendance records, so there's pretty straightforward out if you're a clock hour school. But if you're a credit hour school and you're not required to take attendance, it could be a little bit more difficult, as I said a while ago. So for an institution that's not required to take attendance, the withdrawal date is the date that the student officially withdrew or provided official notification. If the student did not provide an official withdrawal notification, it could be the midpoint. If you don't have any documentation at all as to when the student last attended class, all you know is that the student walked away from class and there's no record of when. The midpoint is what you can use. It could be that the student had a car accident or got very severely ill and had to go into a hospital, and you got an admissions record that said the student went into the hospital on the maybe 5 days after the 60% mark, or 5 days after the midpoint, and you've got some kind of documentation that shows that the student was not, when the student went into the hospital and you know they hadn't come back since then, that might be something you can use. Dave talked about the leave of absence and using the leave of absence. If the student does not return from a leave of absence, then you would go back to the beginning of the LOA to determine the withdrawal date. And then, of course, the last date of academically related activity is your withdrawal date. A little bit more about withdrawal dates. We've got a lot of stuff here, don't we? Withdrawal date's pretty important because this is the date that you're going to use to calculate the earned percentage. And so it's very important that you get a precise and accurate withdrawal date if you can. So if you're still, other options for schools that are not required to take attendance is that you have to have a process. When I was a director of financial aid, I always loved this term in the regulations. You have to have a process. They never told me what the process was. And I'm glad they didn't, because you don't want us to tell you everything that you have to do. You want to be able to make that determination. But you have to have a process for determining that the student completed the period. And if you can't document that they had at least one passing grade, then they're going to be a withdrawal. Now, this is very important. You notice the word passing there. A student with at least one passing grade may be considered to have completed the withdrawal. If no passing grade, then you have to document completion of the period. Now, is a withdrawal a passing grade? Is an incomplete a passing grade? So if you have a student that has 3 Fs, an I, and 2 Ws, we got a problem, don't we? And so we tend to think about this as no passing grade as a student with all Fs, but it's more than just all Fs. You have to look at those with no passing grade. Sometimes you can put together in your system a grading policy that distinguishes between a student that actually, quote, earned the F, or those students that walked away and got an F because they did not finish the course. If you have a system like that, that helps you identify those students that would be R2T4 for not completing the course. And there are several examples in the handbook that can help you in determining if you want to use that type of system. And you also got all your friends out there that can have developed some of those systems that work, and you might can share it with each other. One more thing about withdrawal: if you're required to take attendance, it's always the attendance records. And those of you that are clock hour schools and have attendance records, you can go back to a Dear Colleague letter in 2004, Gen 0412, and there's some information and guidance there that help you in understanding withdrawal dates and the use of attendance records. We have we talked about LOA a while ago, and if a student fails to return from an LOA, if you're not required to take attendance, it's the date that the LOA began. Now, most schools that I'm aware of that are standard term-based schools, very few of them have LOAs, but if you do have an LOA policy, it would go back to the date the LOA began. But those of you that are clock hour schools, those of you that are required to take attendance, you're going to have the records of the last date of attendance, and you would go back to that last date in your attendance records to determine the withdrawal date on there. There's one little note at the bottom of this slide I think is very important that you need to share with your students when they're thinking about withdrawing and you're giving them some counsel about what's going to happen. Remind them that if they're going on an LOA, if they don't come back from that LOA, that period of time is going to eat into their grace period, and they're going to go into going out of grace into repayment much sooner. They're not going to have that whole 6 months that they would have had if they had completed. So that's just something you might want to be aware of so you can advise your students when you're talking with them. We talk about withdrawal date, and that's very important because this is the date that you use to determine the earned percentage of aid. There's another very important date in R2T4 that we also need to talk about now, and that is called the date of determination. And the date of determination is important because that's the date that the clock starts ticking. Once you've determined that a student has withdrawn from his or her program and is now a withdrawal, once you determine that date, then you have some deadlines that you have to meet in order to comply with the R2T4 regulations. And here it says on this slide, if you're not required to take attendance, that date of determination is the date that the student provided a notification they were going to withdraw, or the date that they became aware that you become aware that the student ceased attendance. But regardless of when you become aware of that date of determination, that's when the clock starts ticking, and you have up to 30 days to make that determination based off of these situations here. It could be the end of the payment period. Maybe at the end of the payment period, when grades are posted and all Fs and Ws and Is come out, and you identify that group of students, you want to do that quickly after the end of the payment period so you can identify whose withdrawals. You've got 30 days after the end of that period. Could be at the end of the academic year if it's a program that has different starts and tops during the year. It could be the educational program, maybe a short program or something. If your institution is required to take attendance, if you're an institution that's required to take attendance, it's the date that the student notified you that he or she was withdrawing, or it would be the last date of attendance from your attendance record. But notice the time frame here. A school not required to take attendance has up to 30 days after those points to make that determination. But if you're a school that's required to take attendance, you have up to 14 days, no more than 14 days, to make that determination that the student withdrew. And again, here's a reference for that. When I said that the clock starts ticking on dates of determination, here are the points that fall into place after that clock starts ticking. Once you've made the date of determination, you have 30 days to do the R2T4 calculation, notify the student of any grant overpayment, and notify the student if they're eligible for any post-withdrawal disbursement. 30 days from the date of determination. The reason why I'm emphasizing this so much is this is one of the top 10 program review and audit findings every year. Schools have problems meeting this 30-day time frame. You also have another time frame, which is returning the funds. If you determine that there were unearned funds and money has to be returned, the school owed portion has to be returned within 45 days, not of the R2T4 calculation, but the date of determination. So if you determine that a student has withdrawn and you've got that 30-day clock ticking, if you wait until the end of 30 days to make the R2T4 calculation, how many days left do you have to return the funds? 15, right? What happens if the person in the business office that does the returns has gone on vacation for a couple of weeks? You got a problem, don't you? So really, you don't want to wait and use up that whole 30 days. You want to do the R2T4 calculation as soon as you can after you make the date of determination, because you rely on other people in your school to also coordinate with you to meet these deadlines. So make sure you've highlighted and marked and are aware of these deadlines. 30 days to make the calculation and make the notifications, 45 days to return the funds. If there's a post-withdrawal disbursement, you owe the student money that he earned even before the withdrawal, and you have to make that post-withdrawal disbursement of grant funds. You also have to do that within 45 days of the date of determination, not the date of the calculation. And then if there is a post-withdrawal disbursement of loan funds, you've got a little bit longer to work that out, and that's 180 days. Dave showed you this slide a little bit earlier, this picture of step one of the R2T4 worksheet. Now, in reality, most of you have a screenshot on your computer software, or you have a third-party servicer that helps you with this, or you may use the R2T4 on the web product, but this is just something to show you how the background of how R2T4 works. And on this particular screen right here, you see in one column, on the left-hand column, is the aid dispersed. On the second column is aid that could have been dispersed. Both of these amounts have to be included in the R2T4 calculation. Aid that has been dispersed is pretty self-explanatory. That's the money that went out the door to the students, right? But the aid that could have been dispersed is a little bit less clear, and sometimes we're not exactly sure what goes into that aid. The first question that always comes to me is, well, why do we have to do that? We'll get that in just a second here, but in order to determine the aid that could have been dispersed, you're basically looking at aid that you calculated the student was eligible for, awarded or originated, if it met the requirements for a late disbursement. And you see the regulation right here in 668.164 that talks about late disbursements. You can find that same information in the handbook about late disbursements. Aid that meets those late disbursement requirements can be included as aid that could have been dispersed. And basically these are the requirements. You have to have an ISER or SAR with an official EFC. Cannot be a rejected one. It has to be one that's been processed with an EFC. If you awarded Perkins or FSEOG funds, made that award internally in your system before the student became ineligible, then that could be included. You have to have originated the loan for the direct loan before the student became ineligible in order to include it, and the same thing with the Teach Grant. So these are your basic late disbursement rules, and these are the ones that you have to follow in determining aid that could have been dispersed. Like I said, why did we include that in the R2T4 calculation? Well, if the student's total aid is greater, then the amount of aid is going to be greater. So if we include that aid that they were eligible for before they became ineligible, and include that in the calculation, then they're going to have a greater amount of earned aid, which would tend to result in less aid that has to be returned. And that's good for the student, right? The more funds that are in the aid that could have been dispersed category results in a smaller amount to be returned. It could result also in a post-withdrawal disbursement because the student earned that aid. Just a reminder here that when you're figuring out which aid you're talking about in step 1 of an R2T4 worksheet, make sure that you're using that aid that corresponds to the period of time that the R2T4 covers. Remember, we have payment period of enrollment, and you want to make sure that you're using the right aid for that period of time. In looking at aid that could have been dispersed, we have some examples. In this first example for credit hour, we have a first-year student that starts on September 1st and withdraws on September 28th. The student got a Stafford loan for $1,000 that was originated but not dispersed because the student was a first-time borrower and had to wait for the 30 days. So even though the student was not eligible to receive that aid at the time, or he was eligible but he could not receive that aid because of the 30-day rule, you would still include that $1,000 as funds that could have been dispersed. But look at the but on the end of this slide. They still can't be dispersed, even though you're including them as aid that could have been dispersed had the student not withdrawn. You still can't disperse that aid because the student didn't stay in for the full 30 days. So it's aid that could have been dispersed, but yet it never will be dispersed. That gets a little bit confusing sometimes. Let's look at a clock hour situation. Students in a 900 clock hour program, and then the student withdraws and was scheduled to complete only 100 hours. Already got the first $1,312 of the loan, so there was a second disbursement of $1,312 or $1,313 that would be included in the aid that could have been dispersed. The student was enrolled, established their eligibility at the start of the semester. They got the first disbursement, but withdrew before the second disbursement. So the student was no longer eligible to get that second disbursement. We would still count it, but the funds could not be dispersed because under the rules of late disbursement, second and subsequent disbursements cannot be made. So it's counted, but the student will never get that money. It'll help, however, to reduce the amount that has to be returned. Okay, another concept in R2T4 that sometimes gives us a little problem is this idea of post-withdrawal disbursement. Remember, the basic principle of R2T4 is the student earns money by attending class. And if they withdraw before the end of the term, of the payment period, then all of that money may or may not have been earned. And so if the student attends long enough to earn a certain percentage of money, but you haven't dispersed that yet, there could result in a post-withdrawal disbursement. That's when funds have been earned but not yet dispersed. Again, if you go through the calculation and there is a post-withdrawal disbursement, you have to meet the late disbursement requirements before you can release that money to the student. You always make the grant funds first before the loan funds in a PWD or a post-withdrawal disbursement. If the post-withdrawal disbursement contains grant funds, you can use those funds to pay for the following charges: tuition, fees, room and board. That sounds very familiar to our payment without authorization, right? That you can do. Basically the same logic. If the student still owes for some tuition, fees, and room and board if contracted, and you have a post-withdrawal disbursement of a grant, you can take those grant monies and put it against what the student owes to you. You're not required to get a student confirmation to pay those specific charges, and you can even use those funds to pay up to $200 of prior year charges. Those are part of our regular cash management rules and disbursement rules. Anything else other than tuition fees and room and board contracted requires a written confirmation. So if the student owes the bookstore charges or some parking fines or library fines, whatever, you would have to get a written confirmation to use the grant funds from the post-withdrawal disbursement for those. Now, after you, maybe the student doesn't owe you any money, and you've got a post-withdrawal disbursement of grant funds, then you must disperse those funds as soon as possible, but within 45 days of the date of determination, not the date that the R2T4 was calculated, but the date of determination. So grant funds have to be paid out within 45 days. That same time frame that you're returning money to the federal government on the school's part, if there's a post-withdrawal disbursement of grant funds, they have to go out that same time frame. Now, what if the post-withdrawal disbursement is loan funds, which seems to me to be a more common event? Those post-withdrawal disbursements have to be made within 180 days of the date of determination. But remember, the late disbursement rules, if it's a second or subsequent disbursement of a direct loan, you cannot make that post-withdrawal disbursement even though those funds were earned. You see here in the third bullet that if it's a post-withdrawal disbursement of direct loan and it's within the 30 days, that would fall under that same restriction. Now, here's the thing about post-withdrawal disbursement and loan funds. Once you determine that there's a PWD of loan funds, you need to notify the student and you offer the student those funds in parent if it's a plus loan. And you must offer that opportunity for a post-withdrawal disbursement within 30 days of the date of determination, and you have to request that the student or the parent confirm back to you, yes, I do want that money. And if they do confirm back to you and accept that offer, then you would pay them the post-withdrawal disbursement. But you cannot do anything without the confirmation back from the parent or the student, parent bar or the student, that they accept the PWD offer. You must obtain, if they still owe you money and they accept the offer, you still have to get a written authorization for them to use that PWD loan money to pay for charges other than the current charges. Another thing about post-withdrawal disbursement is that, remember, you have to notify them within 30 days. This is another one of your time frames that you could get caught on in an audit or a program review if you don't make that notification within 30 days, so make sure you keep that up. You need to explain to the bar that they have the opportunity to decline all or portion of the loan. These are students that have withdrawn from school, right? They're no longer going to school. If they accept this post-withdrawal disbursement of the loan, they're assuming that they're the responsibility to repay that loan. Do they really want to borrow that money if they're not going to school anymore? Taking on a legal obligation. So you need to counsel them on that. But if they want to decline the loan, they need to be told that they can do that. You have to request confirmation of any amount that's to be credited to the student's account or directly dispersed to the bar. They need to confirm back to you that they do want that offer. You have to explain to them that this is a loan, you're going to have to pay it back. And you need to give them an opportunity to consider that offer of a PWD. You have to give them at least 14 days to respond. So you send a letter out and say, we're notifying you of a PWD. We need to hear back from you within 14 days of the date of this letter, or we'll consider that you do not want the loan. So you have to give them some deadline, at least 14 days for that. Now you have some options. If they don't respond to you in that 14 days, you do not have to continue to do that loan for them. You can cancel the loan. You may decide not to disperse that loan. But if you decide not to disperse it, you need to notify them and let them know what's going on. Now, Dave walked you through the calculations a while ago. And when you do the calculations, the first thing that's going to be calculated is the amount of money that the school owed portion that has to be returned to the program. So if funds do have to be returned to the program by the school, you have to return those funds within 45 days of the date of determination. Not the date of the R2T4 calculation, but the date of determination. And so make sure that you're calculating early enough to give you some time to get that money back. The return is considered to have been made when the institution deposits the funds back into the bank account and then awards it to another student, or returns the funds to the department through the G5 function. You need to be able to document the dates that happened so that in an audit they can tell that, that you met that 45 days. Make sure that's documented. In some cases, a student may leave and then come back in the same period. Don't you just love that? Well, if they re-enter during the same clock hour program within 180 days, the student is eligible for the same amount of money as prior to the withdrawal date. You basically undo everything and the student gets that same money. If they return after 180 days, the student's return is considered a transfer to a new program, and then you treat those hours remaining in the program as if they're a student's entire program. Go to volume 5 of the handbook if you're a clock hour school and read that section. It'll help you understand exactly what all this means. We're just giving you a brief overview here, but there's more details, and I would encourage you to go look at that. Title IV credit balances. We know what that is. That's when we've paid off the school bill and that money's there to go back to the student. If a student withdraws before you have dispersed the credit balance to them and there's a credit balance sitting out there, you need to have some type of communication process with your business office or your bursar that says, this student's withdrawn, put a hold on that credit balance. We don't want that money going out the door until we know if that student's eligible to receive that money or not. So make sure you have a good process to put a hold on. When you do the R2T4 calculation, you consider that amount that's in the R2T4 credit balance as money that has been dispersed. It's not aid that could have been dispersed. It's already been dispersed because it's sitting in the student's account. And so that's where it would go in the calculation. You would need to determine if that credit balance is going to change because of any policies, because there may be some things that are going to change that balance after you go through all of your departure stuff. One thing you need to remember is that you always do the Pell recalculation first before you do the R2T4 calculation. And when you do the Pell recalculation, some of that money may be going back to the Pell program before you even get to R2T4. So make sure that you determine that credit if that credit balance changes. After the R2T4 calculation, if there is still a federal Title IV credit balance, then that money goes to the student according to the normal cash management rules. You pay that grant to the student, and the credit balance has to be liquidated within 14 days. So keep that in mind there. Another couple of issues about R2T4, and one of them is verification. Sometimes students withdraw early in the semester or later in the semester, whatever it is, but they withdraw before you have completed verification on that student for that period. Now, if they withdraw and verification is not completed, you have to return any interim disbursements of aid that's subject to verification, and you don't include those in R2T4. Now, I hope you don't do interim disbursements. I was a director for 28 years, and I can tell you, I can count to you on less than one finger how many times I did an interim disbursement. I just didn't do them. And this is one of the reasons I didn't, because there's a huge liability to the school. But if you did an interim disbursement, that money has to be returned and you don't include it. You only include the unsubsidized and plus loans. Now, if the student is still within your deadline for your verification policy and they get those verification documents into you, then you complete verification, determine the student's eligibility, and you would need to do a new R2T4 calculation based off of the results of the verification. Those things are a little bit complicated, and you hope you don't get in those situations. FSEOG. If you're participating in the FSEOG program, you know that you match those funds. And there's a number of different ways to match FSEOG. You could either do the individual recipient match, you could do an aggregate match, or you could do a fund-specific match. Now, it's very important in determining which funds go onto the R2T4 worksheet for FSEOG because you're only looking at the federal part. If you're using the type 1 or 2, which is the individual recipient or aggregate match, then you should be able to figure out the 75% federal share, and that would be the part that goes in the R2T4. But if you're mixing the funds together in the fund-specific area, you can't isolate those, so you have to use the 100% of the FSEOG award in that calculation. Make sense? So make sure you're putting the correct amounts for FSEOG in the program. Now, Dave mentioned to you that we have several some case studies at in the handout. So we're going to skip down to slide 78. Here, you can use those, go back home and look at those case studies, and they'll help you understand. I want to talk to you just a second here about some resources that are available to you if you want to know more and learn more about how to do R2T4. How many of you have been to the FSA e-training website? Good. Those of you that haven't, I would encourage you to go out there to the FSA training website and see what we've got there. It's simply fsatraining.info. If you go out there, you'll find where we have put training there. This is what the home page looks like of when you get to the site. If you haven't been there before, when you go, it'll ask you to create a username and an ID to get in. That's just to help us track who's been there, and also if you want credit for your internal evaluations, you can have a transcript of what you completed and show it to your supervisor. But once you've got an account there and you go in, we have a training module for R2T4, R2T4 standalone course. It's up at the top there, and you can go to it. We have training for clock hours, we have training for credit hours, we have training for modules. It's self-paced. You can go there anytime and do that. I would encourage you to go and visit those and go through that course. We're going to update it this coming year and make it, add a few more bells and whistles to it and some updated examples, but it's still a good course that you can use. Another thing in the FSA training website is our FSA Coach product. A lot of you are familiar with FSA Coach. We've done a lot of changes to it over the last few years. We have, this is what it looks like on the page when you go there. We actually have 4 FSA Coach courses now. One of them is our basic course that's been around for a long time. In the basic course, we have a module on R2T4, very similar to the standalone course. As you go through basic, you can learn more about R2T4. We have an intermediate course that has a module on R2T4 and modules. And so if you want to know more about that, we have those there for you. And then we have in FAA Access to CPS Online, we have what we call R2T4 on the web, which is a product that is an electronic version of our R2T4 worksheet. We've showed you some screenshots of the paper worksheet. You can go to the FAA Access to CPS Online, and we have it there, and it can help you do a calculation online. If you decide, if you don't have a proprietary software that has your own R2T4 calculations there, you can go here and do it electronically. One of the nice things about R2T4 on the web is that it will save your calculations, and you can come back and print them later if you need them for audit purposes or review purposes. So if you don't have your own software, I would encourage you to go there and use R2T4 on the web. It's a very nice product. Here's the URL for it. You have to enroll in SAIG to get the FAA Access to CPS Online access there, and then once you're able to get into it, you can go and find the link to the web application, and it's there for you. Great tool. Some other resources that have come out over the years, we've got our regulations that began back in 1998 when they were passed, and the final regulation was in 1999. We generated several dear colleague letters to clarify the guidance on those regulations. One of them we've already mentioned was Gen 0412 that talks about the attendance and taking attendance. Then there's another one that came out after the final regulation of 2010. That is Gen 1114, which is your guidance about R2T4 modules and our current guidance that we're working under. Very important letter. If you've never looked at it, go back and read it, and it will give you a lot of information. The last bullet on this page is something I always try to include in my presentation, and that is the program integrity Q&As. You know, when we put the regulations out there and we present the guidance, sometimes we miss some things. And you are so smart that you find the things that we overlook, and you ask us hard questions about, well, what did you mean in this guidance, or what did that regulation mean? And we realize that we left something out. And so the program integrity Q&As take the questions that you gave us, and we give you additional guidance based off of those scenarios and questions that you pointed out from the original guidance. And people like Dave and some of his colleagues respond to those Q&As, and they're out there. And if you have a question about R2T4 that you don't see in the handbook, then you can probably find them in the Q&A. All right. So that's our R2T4. I hope you learned something from this and can go back and have a good time doing R2T4. We ran out of time for questions, I think, so I think we're going to be around if you need something.
Yeah, that's right. If you guys would like to come up, I'm having the next session start in just a few minutes, so I'm hanging out. Please feel free to come up and we'll chat with you about your questions in between sessions. Thank you, and thanks a lot for coming today.